And my criticism is based on the French military structure as a key weakness of the fall, which is decentralized districts, and they just got destroyed. Here Lenin says, but two mistakes destroyed the fruits of their splendid victory. The proletariat stopped halfway. Instead of setting about expropriating the expropriators, it allowed itself to be led astray by dreams of establishing higher justice in the country, united by a common national task. Such institutions, such as the banks, for example, were not taken over. The Proudhonist theories about a just exchange, etc., still prevailed among the socialists. The second mistake was excessive magnanimity and on the part of the proletariat. Instead of destroying its enemies, it sought to exert moral influence on them. It underestimated the significance of direct military operations in civil war, and instead of launching a resolute offensive against Versailles, and Marx made that comes from Marx, that would have crowned its victory in Paris, it tarried and gave the Versailles government time to gather the dark forces and prepare for the blood-soaked week of May. And Marx, the last phrase that he says on his essay, The Civil War in France, he says, its martyrs are enshrined in the great heart of the working class. And I'd like to close by saying it's up to us to redeem them. Okay, I'll try and answer questions as much as I can. I would love to hear an anarchist perspective on the Commune. I know that Bakunin and Kropotkin, and I think later, Goldman wrote about it. But does anybody have any feedback on, from an anarchist perspective on the Commune?
I don't.
Okay. Well, we'll have to talk about that later then. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Well, it seemed that Marx and Lenin both had criticism about why it failed. What do you think the chances of success would have been had they followed those directives? Had they, for instance, done, as they suggest, like appropriating banks and etc.?
I think the outcome would have been drastically different. I didn't cover a notable revolutionary. His name was Louis Blanqui, and he's one of the most important revolutionary figures through the European revolutions of 1848, and he was imprisoned by I think in Versailles. And I don't have that source. I believe his idea was to set up a dictatorship and overthrow the bourgeois, and that was kind of the ends in and of themselves. Establish a dictatorship, overthrow the bourgeois. That was it. Maybe if there was some better, obviously some centralized organizing, and they did take the banks, I think things would have been drastically different. In my opinion, the communards were way too nice, and like Lenin said, they were just like, yeah, just here, have some money. We don't care about our debts, and and they were slaughtered. I mean, like the figures were stated. It was like 10 to 50,000. That's a ton of people to get absolutely slaughtered. So, yeah, I think if they were to take the banks and the organization were different, I feel like that's what begs the entire split between anarchists and Marxists, was those two issues.
Well, you can answer this if you want, perhaps we can just open up for discussion, but one of the significant factors of the first French Revolution in 1789 was terror. Right? You have massive amounts of terror going on to defend the Republic. You're constantly executing counter-revolutionaries, maybe some people were innocent, but lots of bloodshed, and you have the king being destroyed completely and utterly. You have people, again, law of the maximum, where you sell grain above a certain price, you get executed, no ifs, ands, or buts. So do you think that terror was present during this Paris Commune?
I think
If so, do you think, if it was absent, do you think it was it should have been a necessary condition for a possible victory?
I can't give that an answer from my perspective because I don't have a position on that yet, at least. But I know the Jacobins, who took huge pride, in the French Revolution, they were in I think in the Northeast District. And it's interesting to note that the Northeast District was the last to be overthrown by, French forces. That's significant. So, but again, it goes back to they were all separate districts, completely out of conjunction with each other, and they got slaughtered. Tragedy.
Well, okay, with regard to revolutionary terror, I mean, based on what we've just heard, the commune wasn't defeated by necessarily counter-revolutionaries or people trying to restore capitalism within the commune. It was destroyed by a military force that came in and wiped them out. Like, I'm sympathetic to like criticisms that say like they should have marched on Versailles. They should have not been nice to the banks. They should have just they should have just like been like, all right, that's it, we're doing it.
Yeah.
Like, that's great, but I mean, as far like I don't see that the revolutionary terror is a necessary condition for defending them against the French army.
If I may, Marx, and this is in the Civil War in France, which I can send you the link, and it should be read by everybody here. He said the communards should have dealt more harshly with counter-revolutionaries, and I feel like that kind of implies maybe what Chris is saying about revolutionary terror.
Man, give a response real quick.
No,
Well, I mean, this is the thing, right? If they had lined up all the bankers, right, and executed them, you probably would have some really less amounts of bankers coming back to reclaim most of their property, it seems to me at least. So you can make a lot of people dead, and they can't necessarily exercise counter-revolution against you.
Two things. One is, at this time, wasn't Napoleon III in the custody of the Prussians because his army had been captured?
Yes.
And so wasn't the entire governing of France basically governed out of a weak coalition from Versailles?
Yeah, that's correct.
I
believe the commander was Thiers.
Thiers.
Yeah, he was the next in line of command, but continue.
And so at the very outbreak of the Paris Commune, they very easily could have marched on Versailles and put the weak provisional government under, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. But at the same time, I believe there were 6 main heads of the council with 92 delegates. These 6 were the main, and they were actually executed later. I'm sympathetic to them because, I mean, they're setting up a system that had never been implemented before, at least not to my knowledge. And I mean, they had to do not just the legislation. They didn't just have to handle the legislative powers. They also had to do the executive. I mean, and like I said, I think it was 6 days they were already under attack. They should have done it as soon as they could, and that goes to kind of the overlying criticism of course, Marxist-Leninists would say that's why Lenin danced in the snow when the USSR lasted longer than 2 months.
Also, I mean, weren't there strong elements of counter-revolution? From what I understand, weren't bankers and the rich in Paris feeding information to the French troops?
Yes, but they weren't the main contributors to a lot of counter-revolution. It was actually a political activist who was spying and who was getting paid for it by Versailles, and he headed. Or he was part of the council committee of the National Guard, and he basically gave Versailles all of the information. I think according to some of my sources, there were some counter-revolutionaries, but in my opinion, it wasn't all not dealing with counter-revolutionaries in a correct manner. It was they weren't organized. And of course, different districts should also be looked at differently and according to what happened when, I think. Because there was a certain district that had, more banks, just geographically wise. That should have been considered. So, does anybody have any more questions? Okay, thank you very much.